Waterfront and received a full scholarship at the University of Southern California. Earned a BA in political science in 1975, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude. Received his Juris Doctorate from Georgetown Law School, 1978. Worked for EPA in Washington. During his third year at Georgetown, he did his clerkship to practice law with the Vermont Agency of Environmental Conservation, closing down dumps and landfills that are polluting our groundwater. In 1980, Rick Sharp, future governor then Howard Dean, and environmental studies professor Tom Hutzforth formed the Citizens Waterfront Group to advocate for a bike path along the Burlington Waterfront instead of the hotel/condominium projects being proposed at the time. Through a series of ballot initiatives, this group was able to get the Burlington Bike Path installed and save the Burlington Waterfront for public use forever. And I can attest to that because Rick, when my family was here, we did a e-bike rental from Rick, and we e-biked the waterfront and the causeway, which directly connected to the Burlington Waterfront. And then we rented some segways from him the next day, and we had a great time. So would you please welcome Rick Sharp.
Thank you very much. So I really, great introduction there, John. Thank you for that very much. It gives you a good idea of my background and how I got to where I am today. So, but to really understand the story of the Burlington Waterfront, you really got to go all the way back to Ira Allen. I assume you all know who Ira Allen is. Probably the most important and most influential person in Burlington today. And that's because of the University of Vermont. He gave the land that became the University of Vermont. The University of Vermont is now the driving force for the economy of northern Vermont. If you've been down to southern Vermont recently, you'll notice that the economy down there is entirely different. There are a lot of empty buildings and a lot of towns that are shriveling. My hometown of Bellows Falls graduates 64 kids per year now. They were graduating 140 when I was in school there in 1971. So the reason that northern Vermont is going the way it is, University of Vermont. Ira was very, very cognizant of the fact that he wanted Burlington to become a place of consequence, and he's certainly been successful in that. The driver is the university that he created at the top of the hill in Burlington, Vermont. So you got to then begin to think about what was going on in the early years there when Ira arrived here in northern Vermont to survey the area for land speculation. He was looking to pick up the land grants that were granted by Governor Benny Whitworth from New Hampshire and then sell them off. So he arrived here in 1772. Started to look around, noticed the falls in Winniski, and could see that that was going to be the future source of power for sawmills and other things. Became a very important thing for him. But unfortunately, then the Revolutionary War comes along, and there are British gunboats going up and down Lake Champlain, so you cannot establish any homes in Burlington or anything until after the war is resolved. In 1782, the Battle of Yorktown, the treaty with the British established the border to the north of us here about 30 miles, and this became part of the United States. At that point, the city of Burlington was established just over the hill from the falls in Winniski, and that's why it's located where it is today. Because if you think about it, why would you locate the largest harbor on the Lake Champlain at an unprotected sandy beach? Okay, you wouldn't do that. It looks like you have a perfect harbor down to the south in Sheldon Bay, you got a perfect harbor in Alex Bay. Why would you locate it on a sandy cove that needs a breakwater that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce? It's because when you came up over from the falls Falls. The closest point to Lake Champlain was Burlington itself. So the first dock was established there in 1783. That was a salt dock at the foot of Maple Street. It was called Wharf Street at the time, and that's where the city of Burlington grew up from, is that one wharf. Okay? If you go to the corner of Battery Street and Maple today, you'll see the stone store built in 1827 by Timothy Follett. It was like the first Walmart of the area here. They were bringing all the goods in for the boats at the salt dock, unloading them into that beautiful building that has survived to today. Remember that back in those days, water was your main form of transportation. There were no roads, no railroads into this area. So everything that came in or went out of Burlington did so by the lake. The lake was the superhighway. At the time, when they opened up the Champlain Canal, connecting Lake Champlain to the Hudson River, in 1823, that was like extending that water superhighway all the way to New York City. Thereafter, you could load the goods in a boat in New York Harbor, unload them here in Burlington Harbor. So that really established Burlington as the leading port on Lake Champlain, and made it into the city that it eventually became over a period of time. The other thing that you need to remember about that era is that as the city grew and more wharfs were added, they kept on filling in portions of the lake down there. Okay? And Burlington was very fortunate to have the Whiskey River, mouth of the Whiskey River, located just to the north of them there. So they were floating the logs down the Whiskey River, clearing the emerging Green Mountain Forest, taking them down to the sawmills that were located on the Burlington shoreline, and milling them into lumber there. They were then shipping most of that lumber down to New York City. A lot of New York City was built with lumber that passed through Burlington, Vermont. Burlington's population actually doubled between 1865 and 1875 as those sawmills really took off. Burlington became the third largest lumber port in the world in 1875, and right behind Chicago and Albany, New York. So, but the problem with Lake Champlain, of course, is that it freezes over during the wintertime. So you mill all those logs into lumber, and you can't take it out over the lake because it's frozen over. You gotta have somewhere to stack all that lumber. So, Mr. Wonder Years here, if you would like to stand up here and pass some of these things around. This is what the Burlington shore looked like. We can pass it around here. It looked like in 1875 at the height of the lumber industry. So because of the, you can sit down there. Because of the, sorry, I'll pass some other ones up in here too. But because of the logging industry and the need to be able to stack your lumber somewhere during wintertime and wait for the ice to go out, you had to create more flat space on the Burlington Waterfront. Not a lot of flat space down there, so what they did was they took all the trimmings off the logs, all the sawdust, poured it into the lake to create more flat space to stack lumber. And that's what that photo will show you. That's probably the height of the lumbering industry in the 1870s or so. Over a period of about 200 years, that filling in ends up coming out to about 60 acres that are filled into the lake over that period of time. That becomes very important in the 1980s, just about the time I arrived in Burlington, Vermont with my law degree, because of the fact that the former bed of the lake belongs to all the people of the state of Vermont. Under a case that comes out of Chicago in 1892. So, Great Chicago Fire, 1871. Got a lot of demolition material they got to get rid of it, so they take it all and they pour it into the lake just east of Michigan Avenue. If you go to Chicago today, you'll see about 3 acres of park space that are on the east side of Michigan Avenue. That was all filled into the lake after the Great Chicago Fire. Then the railroads and the state of Illinois get into a spat over who's going to control that filled-in property and what they're going to use it for. That lawsuit goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. 1892, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that the public trust doctrine says that the bed of the lake belongs to all the people of the state in which it's located, and it has to be used for a public purpose. You can't use it for a private purpose. The legislature can't give the property away because it's an public trust interest remains in that field property forever. Okay? So very similar to what happened in Burlington, Vermont, right? So over a period of time, as the lake gets filled in, the railroads end up taking over after the logging goes out, and they maintain the junkyard on the Burlington Waterfront for the next 100 years, from the 1870s to the 1970s. Ugly oil storage tanks, up to 90 oil storage tanks along the shoreline there at one point. They were, some of them 150 feet high, 300 feet across. Pass out some more photos here for you that you can look at as you go along and show the old waterfront and the oil tanks that were located there. So, industrial wasteland, industrial uses down there, you couldn't even touch the water because of all of the junkyard that was being maintained down there. So when I got here in 1978, the only piece of access to the waterfront for the public was Perkins Pier. Everywhere else you looked down there, there were huge berms around the oil storage tanks with the wire at the top and everything. It was pretty amazing. I ended up running into Howard Dean in politics in 1978, and 1980 rolls all around, and the Pommel Real Estate Agency is proposing 2 18-story luxury condominium towers for redevelopment of the waterfront. You got to remember that the late 1970s, throughout the United States, a lot of cities were turning to their waterfronts with the idea of redeveloping them into something more useful and more modern. Probably the best example, and one of the very early ones, was Baltimore Harbor, which was renovated in accordance with a plan by Benjamin Thompson, a very famous architect at the time. Benjamin went on to do South Street Seaport in New York City, and then Faneuil Hall in Boston. So all 3 great success stories of turning a derelict old waterfront in those 3 cities into a thriving tourist attraction over that period of time. So Burlington gets the same idea, late 1970s. Tom Hudsmith is a professor at the University of Vermont, and he takes a year off to do a sabbatical studying industrialized waterfronts throughout the United States. Comes back to Burlington to do a lecture in 1980 to talk about how the Burlington waterfront could be redeveloped. Howard Dean attended that meeting along with myself, and we talked to Tom about the possibility of rehabilitating the old railroad right-of-way out in Burlington's New North End from Letty Park north to the mouth of the Livingston River, about 4 miles, turned it into a bike path and been abandoned as a railroad in the 1970s. So we decided we wanted to talk with Tom more about that. Howard doesn't drink, so we didn't go to a bar. We went back to my law office instead. And that night we formed the Citizens Waterfront Group. A group to advocate for a bike path along the Burlington shoreline rather than these hotel condominium developments that were popping up in the 1980s like wildflowers. So you got to remember the first plan for waterfront redevelopment, 1978, was the Triad plan. That would have filled all that green space that we now call Waterfront Park, hotel and condominiums within 25 feet of the lake's edge. That plan failed pretty quickly because of the lack of finances. The Pommel Real Estate Agency then took over their option with the railroad on 11 acres just north of College Street, and they proposed that 2 18-story luxury condominium towers would have been located on that big green space we now call our event space. That's where we have the marathon, finish line, the jazz festival, Grace Powell concert. All those things happen on that big green space we call our event space now. That's where they're going to build the 2 18-story condominium towers with a private marina, all that within 30 feet of the lake's edge. So, so we put forth the bike path plan in opposition to that, and we went to Mayor Gordon Parkett at the time, asked him to put it on the city ballot to see if the voters would be in favor of a bicycle path instead of these towers. He wouldn't do it, of course, because it was going to cost a lot of money to create this bicycle path thing, and that would mean taxes would go up. So he refused to put it on the ballot. We collected petition signatures from 5% of city voters, got it on the ballot anyway. After a lot of promotion, March of 1981, same year that Bernie Sanders was elected mayor of the city of Burlington, we had the Bike Path resolution passed by 75% of the city voters. So Bike Path didn't go anywhere for the next 3 years. Bernie Sanders had been elected mayor, and he had a focus on social programs and building a political machine. Didn't have a lot of time for a bike path and certainly no money. So there were no studies done, no funding for the bike path or acquisition of rights of way or anything like that. Finally, out of frustration, by 1984, our group proposed a $2 million bond for construction of the bike path. Bonds had to pass by a 2/3 majority in the city of Burlington, so it was a real uphill battle to begin with, and Mayor Sanders and City Council were not behind the bond because it would raise taxes tremendously. So without the support of the mayor or the City Council, we ended up getting it on the ballot again with collecting petition signatures from 5% of city voters and a lot of promotion. We received 55% support from city voters. Not enough to pass the bond because you have to get the 2/3, but send something to the politicians that over the majority of the people in the city of Burlington wanted to tax themselves on this bike path issue for $2 million. So by November of that year, Bernie and the city council supported a $750,000 bond, not enough to get the job done, but it passed by the necessary 2/3, and that was the money that was used to create the bike path from Oak Ledge Park to the mouth of the Williston River. There were a couple of gaps in it. There was about a mile that was an old industrial road that ran through what was called the North Field, the Philadelphia property. That went on for about 25 years. You used to have to take your bike down there and navigate around all the potholes in the old industrial road and everything. And they finally redid that about 4 years ago into what I call Bike Path 2.0. This time, completing the path going into the city together, $16 million. And that says that the city of Burlington, of course, understands that the bike path is a number one attraction for the city of Burlington on TripAdvisor today, and it's worth spending $16 million to double the width of the path from 6 feet to 12 feet and put in running paths on both sides from one end of the city all the way to the other. And that project was just recently completed. They also moved the bike path from the east side of the railroad tracks used to cross there at College Street down to King Street, and then recross the railroad tracks on the other side. That again was a compromise of painting a line on some existing pavement rather than getting a right of way from Pecor and putting the bike path on the right side of the railroad tracks in the first place. That was just completed with the Amtrak coming into town here recently. So those improvements have been made to the bike path now, and it's been a big success. So after the battle on the bike path was pretty much finished, the Apollo plan went down the tubes by 1982, and then the third plan for waterfront development emerged, which was the most dangerous. That was the Alden plan, 1983. So we debated the Alden plan for 2 years, from 1983 to 1985. Bernie Sanders was the leading champion of the Alden plan. He had 12 out of 13 city councilors behind him. You got to remember that, that was a derelict waterfront down there for 100 years. Everybody was so sick of the mess that had been down there for so long. This was the third plan for major development of the waterfront to come along. The plan was put forth by Benjamin Thompson himself, the guy who had done Baltimore Harbor, South Street Seaport, and Daniel Hall. So there was a lot of pressure to go with this development of the waterfront under the Alden plan. Alden plan would have included a hotel, 7 stories tall, 25 feet from the lake's edge, right on the edge of what is now the boardwalk. So if you can imagine the people on the swinging chairs there now, that's where the 7 stories of glass would have been. Big cement parking garage on one side, big cement parking garage on the other side, because you can't go down on the waterfront, the water is there. So the whole parking garage has to be above ground. That 150 luxury condominiums out around that space that we now call our net space. So you would ask, why would Bernie Sanders and the city jump at something like that? And the reason was that they were so sick of that derelict waterfront that they were ready to take just about anything at that time. So that put me to work as a attorney to research what happens when you fill in land into a harbor like Burlington Harbor. So I got hold of a couple of interns from the University of Vermont, and we started to research the issue of what happens when you fill in the land. And lo and behold, we come up with that case from Chicago that says that the bed of the lake belongs to all the people of the state, has to be used for public purpose. Well, hotels and condominiums don't sound like a public purpose to us. So we began to lobby instead for reclaiming the property under the public trust doctrine. Railroad or no railroad, railroad was threatening to keep it as a railroad property, a junkyard, for the next 100 years. They didn't get a good price on it, and the only way they were going to get a good price was if you built hotels. When you're doing that, it's worth $400,000 or $500,000 a day. As park space, it's worth zero. Okay? So we were the ones that fought against the Alden plan through 1983 and all the way to a vote in December 1985. Now, who the hell holds a vote on December 10th in the city? No one. The reason that they held that vote on December 10th is Bernie and the progressives and the Republicans felt that they had an advantage at that time of the year. The students would all be studying for exams and everything. They would be listening to Sharp and his environmentalists saying that you got to reclaim the land as public trust property, and that they could scoop the thing right through at that point. They needed a $6 million bond to proceed with the Alden plan. Notice that Bernie poses a $2 million bond in 1984 for construction of the bike path. In 1985, 2 years later, he's supporting a $6 million bond to put this project on the waterfront. And we're like, we can't believe it. This is the guy that was saying, no enclaves for the rich in the Burlington Waterfront in 1981. I'm one of the people, those 10 people that put him over the top at that time, because that's what he was saying then. Completely changed his tune by 1985 when he's supporting the Alden plan at that point. So the other thing that really irks me is that Bernie's attorney, John Franco, you probably don't know about him, he's now on the other side of he's part of the reason that we have that big hole in the middle of downtown Burlington right now is that John's on the wrong side of development there. He was on the wrong side of development on the waterfront as well, because he knew about the public trust case, he knew about that case from Chicago. He was being squelched by Bernie to not say anything about the public trust doctrine and the rights that the people had in that property down there all the way through that debate. Okay, so finally it comes to a head in December of 1985, and we held them to a 54%. So they didn't get the 2/3 that they needed. The bond goes down the tubes. The Alden plan fails, and then Bernie finds the public trust doctrine, and they take it to the Vermont Supreme Court. 1989, the Vermont Supreme Court rules the public trust applies to the fill down of Burlington Harbor, voila, 60 acres of park space and public buildings. All the hotels and condominiums get set back on the other side of the railroad tracks, okay? So you got to then think about what was the net result on the city of Burlington of the way that we developed that waterfront. Suddenly, we went from one hotel downtown for the last 40 years, the Hilton, to 4 hotels in the space of 8 years. Okay? The Marriott was built about 15 years ago. Hotel Vermont was built behind it 8 years ago, and the Hilton Garden Inn over on Main Street was built about 5 years ago. So it went from 1 hotel to 4 in the space of 8 years. That doesn't happen in a city of 43,000 people, but once a blue moon. And the blue moon, of course, is you correctly developed your waterfront with the bike path and the waterfront park. Now people pay $500 a night to stay at the Hilton because it's the Hilton on the Burlington Waterfront rather than out of the Sheraton for $250 by the interstate. So that's a big success story for the city of Burlington, and I'm very happy that I had a part in that. The other thing that I think is needs to be mentioned also, and I'll pass around some more photos here, so we'll get to that in just a minute. Is the Church Street Marketplace, okay, which was also converted to a pedestrian mall during that period, 1980, thanks to a plan by Bill Truax, who foresaw that cars needed to be put on the back burner at that point, and took it out of, I'll pass this around as well. That's a photo of Church Street as a street. So those are the two things that really made a big difference in the city of Burlington, I think, is the pedestrianization of Church Street and the way that we dealt with our waterfront to create a public amenity that can be enjoyed by everybody for generations to come. So that was my really involvement in the waterfront, but the story is over there. By 1992, the bike path was complete from Oak Ledge Park to the Baffin-Winisky River. And then people in the town of Colchester began to look across the river there and say, well, what about connecting to that bike path down in Burlington? The old railroad bridge had been taken out in the 1970s. A couple more photos here. The old railroad bridge had been taken out in the 1970s, and the idea was then to rebuild a bridge for pedestrian and bicycle traffic across the Winisky River, so you could take your bike from downtown Burlington all the way up to the causeway. Okay. Causeway was built out into the lake in 1901 on the railroad. They never let you do that today, but back in those days, the railroads were big and powerful. So they were actually able to build the railroad 4 miles right out into the lake in a shallow portion. That right-of-way was abandoned in the 1970s and lay fallow for about 20 years. Then people started to go out there with the bikes, and they realized that, well, we can build a bike path all the way out onto here. So the push was on in Colchester to connect to Burlington with a bike across the Winisky River. Bill McClay, a select board chairman at the time in Colchester, actually got it on the ballot in 1992 to see if the people of Colchester would support the construction of a bridge across the Winisky River. Believe it or not, it failed. And the reason that it failed was because that on the north side of the bike path bridge, they had built a subdivision right on top of the old railroad right away back in the 1970s, 60s or 70s. And that meant that if you were going to continue the bike path north of the bridge to Airport Park and then out to the causeway, you would have to go through that neighborhood. That neighborhood became very, very concerned about the fact that there was a low-income housing project in Burlington called Northgate that was right on the bike path. And they were sure that if you built a bridge across the river, that those low-income people would come across the river and be stealing things from their property. So there's a lot of opposition to putting the bridge in. Those people prefer to use, I'd say those people prefer to use the Winisky River as a moat instead. So the bridge proposal went down in 1992. But that didn't stop the bicycle enthusiasts. They started to reclaim the causeway, clearing brush off of it. They put new boards down on the bridge and everything so people could take their bikes out there. By 1994, that project was complete. Howard Dean had become governor by that point, and he attended the ceremony for opening the causeway. At that ceremony, Brian Costello was talking to people there. He's a boat captain, and he was talking about running a bike ferry across the river. So you can take your bike out to the bridge abutment there, and then take a ferry across the river in order to get out to the causeway. So Howard heard the talk about the bike ferry, and he came up with, talked to Brian, said that I'd get clear on my desk by Monday. I'll get you $20,000 out of the transportation budget to buy a ferry and the gasoline and crew for the summer. So Brian got it on his desk, he had no plan, he put it together over the weekend. That's how the bike was initiated. So 3 years of taking people across the river by bike, 40,000 people went across the river in that 3 years. And guess what? No increase in crime in the big city. I always like to tell people that criminals don't ride bicycles. They always ride bicycles. I always tell them that you will never see your TV balanced on somebody's handlebars going down the bike. They will come in a car or a truck if they want to ride it. They won't be on a bicycle. So that ended up taking the fever down in the Biscayne Heights area. And lo and behold, by Howard's last year in office, was 2002, I think. He was able to get $3.5 million approved for bike path. Actually, about half of that they got through the legislature. But when it came down to the final meeting, and they found out that the bridge was going to cost, bridge of the causeway was going to cost almost twice as much money, they were able to get that through the committee. The biggie with the bridge was that the original idea was to put the bridge at about 18 feet above the water on the original bridge abutments. But the Coast Guard said they needed more clearance, so we had to raise the bridge up another 8 feet, I think it was, which cost a lot of money to put a new bridge abutment and move it higher. And then the city of Colchester, the town of Colchester, didn't want a wooden causeway through the swampy area there at Delta Park. They wanted something that's cement because the wooden area, wooden treated causeway would be an environmental hazard. It would deteriorate over time and put toxins into Delta Park, and also would deteriorate, and the maintenance would be a big factor. So they went with this cement causeway instead, much more expensive. That brought the cost of the project to $3.5 million. And it was just approved at the end of the time that Howard was there. The next governor was opposed to the project, and that he would have killed the project if it hadn't gotten through it in the final hours of the Dean administration. But the construction of that bridge now allows you to take the bike from downtown Burlington all the way up to the causeway back. They've now moved the ferry, of course, from the river where it's no longer necessary out to the cut in the fill, so that you can take your bike across that little bit of a gap in the causeway to get out to the islands for lunch or whatever. And it's a great ride. We now do segue towards downtown, and we rent electric bikes, mainly for use out on the causeway. Our home is only about 2 miles from the causeway, so it's a pretty easy trek out there, and it's certainly something to see that causeway. So the story of how the whole thing happened and where we're going in the future with development in northern Vermont is all over this book. The Burlington Bike Path and Waterfront Park. It's online if you're interested in it. You can purchase it there. But the whole story is right there of how the whole thing happened. Our bridge across the Winston River is also noted in Peter Harding's new book, published in 2019, Rails to Trails, which is a compilation of rail projects throughout the entire United States. Peter worked for the Rails to Trails Conservancy and was involved in a lot of those projects. He calls the Burlington Bridge the most noble of all those projects because it took the longest to get the bridge constructed. You had to go through the whole bike ferry thing in order for the bridge to end up being a successful addition to the bike path here. But that tells you what a lot of persistence over a long period of time does. It changes your entire community. You know, we have one of the most beautiful bike paths in the state of Vermont, probably in the world, out to the causeway there. because of the persistence of those people in making that happen over a period of time. So that's the story of the bike path. I hope you're interested in it. So I got some other photos here to pass around if you like. This is a photo of the original bike ferry, only 4 bikes on it. This is a cartoon about bringing criminals across the This was the bike ferry bridge being floated into position. That's putting things on the causeway along the bridge, and there's photos of the causeway itself. And the final photo, our hero, Howard Dean.
A younger Howard.
That photo was taken at the dedication of the bridge in 2004. So Peter Frame wrote a really nice article about the whole thing, how all it came about, and what we have here today. So. Any questions or anything?
Were you able to get any federal dollars for this project?
There was some federal dollars. When we started in on this, the climate for bicycling was entirely different. Burlington was not the bicycling community that it is today. Okay. There weren't funds available for the federal transportation, state transportation stuff. That's why we had to do the bond, because those things didn't exist at that time. We did get a federal block grant. That was part of the, I think we developed a mile of the Bike Path north of Letty Park with that block grant. That was back in 1983 or 84, something like that. So there was a little bit of federal money there. There was mostly state money. State money did the bridge, and the city of Burlington did the Burlington Bike Path itself. Colchester chipped in some of the money for the causeway, well, that was also the causeway washed out twice. So it washed out in 2011, where it was completely underwater, and it was about $450,000 to rehabilitate that. If that washout had occurred back in 1990, that thing would be gone. They would never restore it. By the time that it washed out in 2011, the community was so used to using that pathway, they understood what a great resource it was, that there was no doubt that it was going to be restored. Because it had been taken over by the town of Colchester, there was FEMA money available for restoring it because it was flooded out. So they got, I think, $400,000 for FEMA, but it took like 2 years to go through that process and get the whole thing reopened and everything. Flooding again happened in 2018, I think it was, and the state of Vermont kicked in about $400,000, I think it was, to do that. The Colchester's portion of that was 10%, and that was raised by locomotion, so that the town of Colchester taxpayers would have to bear the burden of their 10% contribution. Locomotion, by the way, the reason that locomotion exists today is because of that doing the bike ferry across the river. So this is what happened was that Howard ends up giving them the $20,000. The town of Colchester will accept the $20,000. The chairman of the select board was one of the opponents of the bridge. So he wouldn't take the $20,000 to let them do the bike ferry. We couldn't go to the town of Burlington, the city of Burlington, because that would be Burlington imposing their criminals on Colchester. So the only other option was, we couldn't go directly to Bryan. The only other option was a nonprofit. So they formed Burlington Bikeways at that time. Now, of course, that morphed into locomotion, because Burlington Bikeways is putting their stamp on Colchester and anything like that, so they changed the name to locomotion. Most successful bike advocacy group in the United States today is locomotion. Yep.
I seem to remember that there was a bridge available, but complications off of Beltline, one of the bridges that goes to nowhere.
Yeah.
That there was an interest in moving that, since it wasn't of any use to anybody.
Yeah, it wouldn't have worked. So, you know, you had to, because of the Coast Guard and everything, they had to raise everything up quite a bit. And then the stand itself would have to be moved. The way that they did it here, of course, they floated it into place. They built it somewhere else. They floated it into a place on the river. So I think that would never work. Yeah. Expensive project, $3.5 million a lot, and a hell of a lot of money for a bike path. But I think it's made a big difference in the city of Burlington. Probably millions of dollars of tax dollars that come in, and a much more healthy community that does a lot more biking now than they would have done before. So I'm actually, you know, pleasantly amazed at the way that this whole thing went. Way beyond where we were originally thinking. When those projects were coming up downtown, we were talking about an 80-foot setback. We would have been satisfied with an 80-foot setback with the bike path running in front of those kind of medium units and everything. But of course, they wouldn't agree to that because they were in control. They had Bernie and Republicans and the progressives behind them, so they went for the vote instead, and they failed. So what we have down on the waterfront today is at least 300 feet, some places 400 to 500 feet of space along the waterfront there where the event space happens and everything. So we end up with something much more than what I would have thought. And then the incremental development of the waterfront over that period of time has also been terrific. I don't think any of the skate park or anything, but we actually do our Segway tours. We start out at the skate park, and I've just become so enamored with that skate park. It is terrific. There are 30, 40, 50 kids down there all the time. They're not up on Church Street, you know, with their skateboards. They're down there. They're having a good time. You hardly see anybody smoking cigarettes or anything. You know, maybe some adults, but there's no kids or anything. And you see a lot of families with helping the kids and everything. So the skate park has been a tremendous success. We talked about the Moran plant also. Somebody mentioned that earlier. The Moran plant, of course, was built in 1925 in order to burn coal to generate electricity for the city of Burlington. Okay? That is a public use, so it's on filled land, but it's a public use, and that certainly was all right. The Moran plant closed down in 1980. It was puffing black smoke and everything, and stood all over the cars up on Lakeside, up on Lakeland Terrace. So they closed the plant down. They actually converted it to wood chips for, I think, 3 or 4 years, but even that couldn't meet environmental standards. So they closed the plant down. It sat as a hulk there for the next 30 years. Several plans for redevelopment. There was one plan for an ice wall in there. There was also a plan for a museum like what they built at Echo. But none of those plans ended up working out. So it came down to about 3 or 4 years ago that the city decided that they would tear the plant down because it was just a hulk there and people were, graffiti and everything else on it. So they went and got bids on what it would cost to tear the plant down. $6 million to tear the whole thing down. It's only $3 million if you leave these metal frame and the cement support columns for the boilers underneath. So they decided that route, save the $3 million and leave the frame as kind of a reminder of our industrial past. So that's where we've gone now. Very controversial. Some people think it's very ugly. I personally think it's an interesting thing to do it reminds us of our industrial past, but still has an interest to it. And there's always a possibility down the road that some sugar daddy comes along and decides to put an elevator in with a restaurant at the top. That would be just fantastic. But of course, that would take somebody with a lot of money. Not impossible. If you've one of the Rails to Trails project that Peter Hardick talks about in his book is something called the Walkway Over the Hudson in Poughkeepsie, New York. The old railroad trestle that went across the Hudson River, very, very high, so that all the boats could go up the Hudson River and everything. It had been abandoned, I think in the 1970s or so. It was falling apart piece by piece. There was one guy that was really, really involved in trying to preserve it. He used to take people up there and they'd walk over the trestle and deliver everything. The Coast Guard decided that it either had to come down or something had to be done with it. This guy couldn't do it because it was going to be several $1 million worth of renovation. The Rails to Trails Conservancy got involved in it, and they ended up finding somebody that would invest $20 million in it, and they created the walkway over the Hudson, which is a beautiful walkway now. It's had a really big impact on downtown Poughkeepsie. There's a lot of people that actually come to Poughkeepsie now to stay there to walk over the walkway over the Hudson, get a chance to get down there. We were planning to go down there later in October this year. So, anyway, anything else?
One comment, many people here probably don't know that downtown now we have a bike shop that sells and rents bikes right downtown.
Yes, so
that brand spanking new. I think he's been there maybe 2 months now.
Yep.
I can't remember the name of the business. Anybody know?
Bootlegger, road something.
Yeah, something like that.
Bootlegger, isn't it? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe there's bikes in our future too.
We hope so. That's great. And then more about the rail trail, of course, other big investment that was a federal and state project. I think the feds chipped in about $11 million on that. And that was a real surprise for Governor Scott, because we've been, our group had been advocating for that rail trail for 10 years anyway. Vast did a lot of work on it. They maintained the trail there for years. If you went down there, the bridges were falling apart and everything. You couldn't go across the bridges. You had to go around those places. And all of a sudden, Governor Scott out of nowhere says, we'll put up the $4 million that the state was going to put into it. We got the Memorial Valley Rail Trail and complete, I think, next year or the year after that. So that'll be the longest rail trail in the state of Vermont, going all the way from about St. John's Ferry to St. Albans. So, yeah.
I think I took the last train that made that run. It was kind of this was quite a few years ago.
Yep.
We had some English friends that were visiting us with, so we took them, and of course, from England, they're used to trains, and everybody's out there taking pictures when they back and when they come through the covered bridge, for the rail.
Yep. I'm showing your age there. So.
Everybody knows about it.
The last time that Amtrak or a train came into Burlington Station was over 50 years ago. It's just amazing that it went out that fast. But that's the love affair with the car in the United States today. That we're all now battling with in order to create more rail trails. So if you really think about it, we started out with waterways was our main transportation. Then we went to railroads and built the whole railroad system overbuilt it. That's why we have a lot of abandoned railroads now, because the competition became cutthroat. There was no regulation of who was going to build what and that. And then we went to the highways, which was, of course, the interstate highway system and everything else when cars came along. The fourth form of transportation we haven't built yet, and that's the separated bike paths. So now we got to start thinking in terms of the transportation dollars need to go to creating the infrastructure so that people feel safe biking and walking around rather than relying on cars everywhere that they go. And there's tremendous progress being made in that all the time. You take a look at South Burlington and what they've done. They actually identified the gaps in their separated bike path system, and they're working on those gaps to fill them in as they go along. And of course, they got I think it's a $15 million project, that bridge they're going to build across the interstate. So you will connect downtown South Burlington to Burlington, and of course the University of Vermont. And I don't know if you read the article the other day, but the University of Vermont is now going to be putting housing over in downtown South Burlington. And the reason they can do that is they're going to have this great bike path that's going to run over to their city. So the investment that you make in these things come back to you in spades years later. It may sound like a lot of money, $2.5 million or $15 million to build this bridge, but the infrastructure, once it's in place, makes a really big difference in your community. Great.
Any last questions for